The second thing I would point out that I say these numbers as if they're that precise. They're really not that precise, not down to that exact count. We actually have a range of different studies that we examine, and the plausible range of different studies go from a low of 60,000 to perhaps a high of 110,000. So the true number falls somewhere in there, but I like the number we have now since it agrees with yours.
It was great that it worked.
Yeah, I was worried about that, actually.
That doesn't happen as often as
no,
you think
it
it
doesn't.
should.
They're often wildly discrepant. In fact, that's a good segue to the methodology. We actually don't rely on one single study, one single data source, or one single approach. And had we communicated before, I would have definitely incorporated your approach as well. It actually represents the synthesis of multiple different studies. We in fact examined more than 50 independent data sources. And these did include parts of the census, aspects of the census, random digit dial telephone surveys, community-based surveys, program client data, trying to look at many different ways of approaching the question. And then we assess their limitations, the potential biases, line up the estimates, and choose the middle, just as under the hope that some may err in one direction while others err in the other. And that middle value is the one we're presenting here. So for example, for the MSM population, the men who have sex with men, it was actually 9 different independent ways, different methodologies to come up with a number. The middle one was the one that we used, and so on for male to female transgenders, women who have sex with women, et cetera. I guess one last comment I would make again is that there's no gold standard, so it's very, very difficult to see how far off we are. But again, we're looking for the consistency with different studies, and again, it's reassuring that Dr. Gates is on the same page as we are.
Thank you. And Jerry, our private sector representative for this evening, what means do you use to understand the LGBT market and to reach the LGBT market? And could you talk a little bit about how you use technology, the internet, and other methodologies that are unique to sort of your private sector methodology?
So community marketing's been doing market research for about 15 years, and we do 2 syndicated studies a year, which get quite a bit of press, and then about 12 private studies a year that are focused on for individual clients. We use the internet a lot for taking surveys because about 6 years ago when we were out surveying people on the street, we found that about 95% of the people we were talking to said they had access to the internet on a daily basis and they'd prefer to go that direction. We thought about that a little bit more, and we thought, when was the last time I wanted to talk to somebody that phoned me at home and give them 10 minutes of my time to answer a bunch of personal questions? And I always hang up on them, and almost everybody I've asked that question does the same thing. So we started having to come to the conclusion that that was a difficult way to gather data in 2008. The other end of things is field studies, and we do a lot of field studies for clients where we visit a particular spot or an event and are able to talk to people, but that's, again, very restrictive in the amount of time that people will be able to devote. And finally, we use focus groups that we conduct all over the country, but primarily in metropolitan areas because it's very difficult to find any population of gays and lesbians in a small town to assemble together to talk about things. So we focus mostly on urban areas where most people live. I think I said our 2 biggest studies are the Gay and Lesbian Consumer Index and our annual Gay and Lesbian Tourism Study. The tourism study we've been doing for 12 years. The Consumer Index study last year was the first year for that, but it's the largest gay and lesbian survey that's ever been conducted. We talked to over 25,000 people, over 12,000 gay men and over 10,000 lesbians completed that survey. And it was fascinating because we found people all over the place and in every nook and cranny of the country, much like the census data comes forward with. Let's see. So the first thing you have to do to understand gays and lesbians, I guess, is the approach we take is we ask questions. And most recently, people seem to be interested in what's going on with gays and lesbians as they're getting older. the gay boomer population, and we're getting a lot of requests for custom data and about assisted living and over 55 retirement communities and active living centers, and those kinds of things. So there's a lot going on, but our research focuses on out gays and lesbians that marketers can typically be able to find to be able to bring their products to.
Okay. And they lure you in by promising that you might win an iPod. I've answered the survey. So to stick with Jerry for a second, then, you know, sort of broaching those big numbers that marketers use to sort of target, for an excuse to target the community. Can you address some of the pros and cons of these big numbers and, you know, about the collective buying power of the LGBT community? You know, how are those big numbers arrived at, and is there potential for backlash?
You know, there's definitely, there definitely has been some backlash in the past. There are groups that feel very isolated by those big numbers, and it makes it much harder for them to participate. You know, of the small percentage of people who didn't have daily access to a computer, the likelihood of them having low incomes is very high. So we're leaving those people out at the beginning. Also, we tend to use the gay and lesbian media with publications and websites as introduction contacts for some of our surveys. People that live in smaller towns are going to have less access to those kinds of information sources, and so they may be less likely again to take the survey. But we also really focus on the middle ground of who we survey. When we're doing, we don't use, when we're using averages, we use medians, which is the middle number, not a mean average, which is what most of us learned how to do in math class, where you add all the numbers up and divide it by the total of responses. Means tend to be quite a bit higher because a lot more, or big numbers tend to have a bigger effect on averages than small numbers do. So yeah, definitely there's some backlash, but the pros I think are also very important. One of the things that's come out of having these numbers is corporations opening up their pocketbooks and their wallets to support gay and lesbian events and sponsor gay charities and support things like the HRC and GLAAD, and a lot of money has been raised because of those big numbers.
If I could just add something to that, I mean, it's an interesting, because a lot of the consumer, as you mentioned, there's some backlash of saying, well, you know, if you're so wealthy and so rich, why do you need any kind of rights? That you're all doing fine, you know, why are you bothering? And that definitely happened. But the interesting flip side is today, Massachusetts had a law that marriage, you couldn't get married in Massachusetts basically unless you were a resident or you were from a state where same-sex marriage, if you were a same-sex couple, that same-sex marriage was legal. And it was an old law that was inherited from interracial marriage, to try to prohibit interracial marriages. So people coming to Massachusetts, getting an interracial marriage, and then going home and challenging that. But anyway, that law was rescinded today, and part of the direct reason that happened was that when California passed this thing, we at the Williams Institute put out a study that it was likely going to generate, I think it was about $680 million in revenue over the next 3 years for all the weddings that were going to happen in California. And I am not kidding you, part of the reason Massachusetts opened the gates is they want a piece of that pie. And they got really nervous that California was going to take all this. And, you know, we're in very challenging economic times right now, and people suddenly, this number, which we always, you know, we put these numbers out, mostly the reason we put initially those numbers out is that I don't care what the piece of legislation is, it has to go through an appropriations process. And someone has to, when you do a piece of legislation, even if it's opening marriage to same-sex couples, someone has to say what the budget impact of that is. And largely that was the reason we did it, was that then oftentimes our numbers we would wind up testifying in appropriations committees to say, at the very minimum, this is not going to hurt your budget by doing this. And that was actually an excuse some people used not to support gay stuff. And so it sort of took that off the table. But as I said, the interesting sort of flip side now is that this number is sufficiently large, and we're quite conservative in our estimates, that it was sufficiently large that people paid attention, and I think it was part of the reason why Massachusetts passed the legislation they did.